Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Arte 1, o canal de todas as artes.
Ministério do Turismo e a Associação Casa Azul apresentam 20ª Flip Festa Literária Internacional de Paraty. O projeto conta com benefício da Lei Federal de Incentivo à Cultura. Vale Mais Cultura. Tem patrocínio oficial do Instituto Cultural Vale. Patrocínio Itaú. Copatrocínio O Globo. Apoio Esquilo, Mac Móveis, Prefeitura de Paraty, Globo Livros, Unigel, CQSFV Advogados e Oceana. Concepção Associação Casa Azul. E realização Secretaria Especial da Cultura, Ministério do Turismo, Pátria Amada Brasil, Governo Federal.
Talvez essa minha resistência em viver cubra de propriedade singular meu nome infame. Nascido sob o signo da tragicidade de minha gente, me criei sobre o chão em que os homens só se davam por completos quando desfaleciam as próprias mães em desespero. Os meios diversos em tentar suprir as necessidades afetuosas punham-nos em vergonha perpétua. Amar, declarado, era sempre assinte na boca da minha juventude. Eu estava ali trabalhando, né, como entregador de marmita. E eu falei, pô, o que eu estou fazendo aqui, né? Eu escrevo, eu quero estar assistindo essa galera. Eu quero estar aproveitando esse momento aqui da cidade, né? Um momento que é meu, né? Vou aproveitar ali totalmente frustrado, passando aqui perto da tenda do telão, quando eu distraidão, daqui a pouco pinta um cara, na minha frente, eu dou uma freada assim, porra. Falei, putz, cara. Falei, maluco. Aí quando eu olhei pro cara assim, pô, eu identifiquei ele na hora. Era o Benjamin Zephaniah, um dos grandes nomes daquela edição. Ele é DJ, o cara é poeta. E eu falei, pô, cara, o que eu vou fazer na minha vida? Eu não posso ficar aí atropelando escritores com acebolados e parmegianas. Eu tenho que tomar um rumo na vida. E foram essas situações que acabaram me levando para a escrita, né? O que foi importante? Eu lancei meu livro. A minha mãe começou a estudar, cara, para ler o meu livro. Isso para mim é muito importante. O Eduardo Galeano, ele fala: poucas pessoas de pequenos lugares que fazem pequenas coisas, essas mudam o mundo. E é isso.
Flip 20 anos. Vidas que transformam lugares, que transformam pessoas. Escreva conosco essa história. Faça parte da rede amiga da Flip para continuarmos transformando juntos os próximos 20 anos. Acesse flip.org.br e faça sua doação.
Good evening. A poem by Maria Firmino dos Reis, The Pain That Has No Cure. What most hurts in life is not to be poorly paid for a job or hear the harsh voice of those who should be thankful to us or have our hands bitten by the ingrate who should kiss them, by Gonçalves Dias. What hurts the most of all the pains that's worth not weeping or moaning is our huge, pure, saintly friendship that's despised or misunderstood. That's what most pains a noble soul, indifferent to legal interests, rich in extremes, not begging for friendship, prouder than a powerful king. That's what hurts the most in life. It's the pain that dilacerates the soul. It's the pain that martyrizes and kills, that robs one's belief, serenity, calm. I know not if everyone over the years feels the crushing, atrocious pain as I do, or what misery, or dreams, or wonders alone. I saw escaping me as life escaped the sacred love of my parents. Merciless death stole them from me, paying no heed to my mournful sighs. I saw in the spasms of slow agony die the one I loved in life, lips trembling, sobbing, farewell. Heard by this hapless soul, such pains, reborn alive, that never forget or mourn for life when, how many times, how often, recalling them today, of the red eyes, crying, playing my lyre, I hear a sigh, but these pains dislacerate the soul, are mourning on another sphere in a perennial enjoyment. Live, share divine love, but what most afflicts us, this pain that makes us suffer the most, be a cool recompense for friendship in the chest of a friend, to die. Good evening, I'm Melina Brito. I'm one of the curators of Flip 2022, together with my dear friends Fernanda Bastos and Pedro Meira Monteiro. I'm truly moved. We're going to go into a forest of light in these crossroads between art, sensitivity, nature, paths open, waters, literature, poetry, all of them crisscross with themes that sometimes people may not be so interested in, but I think that the key to everything of coloniality, gender, race, deconstructions, reconstructions, imagination, new narratives, no longer silence. So you can prepare whatever forest of light that you want. We prepare it and re-prepare it and re-elaborate it every day, day after day. We re-elaborate it day after day. To re-elaborate with us today, I wish to invite forward our dear friend, philosopher, feminist, Djamila Ribeiro, and also Rita Segato, Luiz Mauricio Azevedo, and Saidiya Hartman. Thank you.
Good evening to all of you. I would like to thank Flip for the invitation, of the curators Fernanda Bastos, Milena Brito, and Pedro Meira for the invitation to mediate this roundtable, such a strong roundtable, so meaningful, called Entering the Forest of Light. And to enter the forest of light is a very complex metaphor for which we will think about having access to the knowledge produced by discriminated social groups. How can we reach this forest of light? How can we enter this forest of light? What will you find inside this forest? So during this roundtable, the three colleagues here will offer us maybe a pathway, a journey, different journeys, but also journeys that will help us meet inside this forest. Saidiya Hartman will take us through a critical fabule with Rita Segato. We will talk about nonfiction and power. And with Luiz Mauricio, we will walk through this forest through literary critique. Rita Segato, she's an anthropologist, one of the greatest references regarding feminism and violence against women. She was the author of the first proposal of quotas for black and native students in the University of Brasilia, where she was a professor for more than 30 years. University where she taught for more than 30 years. In Guatemala, she worked as an anthropological expert regarding gender in a judgment that was condemning the army against, in terms of violence against women of the Maya women, of the Katsi ethnicity. She has books published, many books published, and also she's a coordinator along with Professor Numalino Gomes and Mar Ribeiro of the studies of Caribbean women, and her books translated in Brazil by Bazar do Tempo Publishing House. She has Pedagogies of Cruelty that will be launched by Bazar do Tempo, the basic structures of violence, war against women, critique against colonialism, essays, and Saints and Daimones, published by UNB. Luiz Mauricio Azevedo, he's a fiction writer, he's an editor, a critic, he's an intellectual with a very vast production. He has written many books, among them Afro-Marxism, Fragments of a Practical Literary Critique by Sulina Publishing House, and The Manipulation of Others by Figura de Linguagem Publishing House. Saidiya Hartman is a writer, professor at the University of Columbia. Her work will move between the frontiers of history and imagination by reading archives and reflecting about the hidden voices of slavery. In Brazil, among the published books is Lose Your Mother, A Journey Along the Atlantic Slave Route. She's launching here during this flip, and her books in Brazil were published by publishing house Bazar do Tempo, Fósforo, and Crocodilo. So I'm going to start here in the order, start asking Rita. Rita, the first time I was reading about the topic of this roundtable, I was thinking about what we're talking about in terms of forest of light. What is a forest of light, which is a topic of this roundtable? The first things which came to my mind were mysterious, magical images. Forest makes us think about nature, earth. So it's absolutely opposing to the colonial thought, which is definitely an opposition of centrality. So how do you see this forest of light, especially when you bring the metaphor of the mirror of the evil witch or queen?
Good evening. I'm truly moved to be here. And so the forest of light is a forest which can be light, and the evil witch's mirror I always talk about, where we ask, where, not us, the bad witch we should also use, or the bad evil queen, because answering a truth, saying that Brazil is racist. It's the evil queen. For a long time, people thought that Brazil claimed that it was cordial. The mirror of light says no. in some way, when I heard the idea of the forest of light, I remembered the idea of the mirror, like luminosity, which shows the truth which is hidden and disguised. Nobody talks about. It isn't part of the discourse. There's no description or discursive consistency. So you cannot struggle against. So the forest of light is a place where there's an enlightenment. This enlightenment happens in a space of nature, a cosmic nature. In more recent texts by me, my thinking addresses what is a cosmos, for example, like Pachamama, or cosmos and religion in the sense of monotheism. So the cosmos in Candomblé, in Pachamama, is a space of light, where truths are more accessible, they're more exposed, and you're able to have the necessary light to be able to reorient the history towards a more benign horizon. Basically, that's the explanation. Luiz, the ways of being in this forest of light, inside the forest, people are formatted to walk in cars as if it was a safari. You often talked about the importance of building a space for black literary critique. From your point of view, what are the greatest challenges for this to happen? Black literary critique. Good evening, everyone here, outside there, in the other worlds. It's a huge joy to be here. This roundtable for me is a kind of bibliography of my work. Everyone here are my references. I owe so much to these heads. They made my head, and I thank everyone who works for Flip, workers who are behind this show, Laura, Fernanda, Pedro, and Milena, people who do the sign language that does incredible work. The interpreters are very important. Talking about attempting to answer briefly, it's always difficult for me to give a quick answer about black literary critique. It's very difficult. Perhaps it is one of the greatest challenges is to do critique of objects which are placed as objects that are so vulnerable that they would not merit being exposed to critical examination. So in a sense, I always think that we have our GPS, our semiological GPS broken. We forget where we came from. They don't know where we are, and we don't have an idea of where we need to go. And critique is placed in this nightmare, and critique has to deal with it, and how to do literary critique of objects that are produced by people whom the social world has already destroyed. It's a huge concern for me. Whenever I analyze a book, if it is produced by a white person, I think, is it a good book? If it's a good book, I say it's a good book. If it's a book produced by a black person, I read the book and I think, is it a good book? If it's a good book, I say it's a good book. But the problem is that when we face white incompetence, it's much easier to say, because it is very clear to me that I'm not going to produce any harm when I say that the white author is terrible. First, because the word is not worth much, because I'm a black critic anyway. Second, because white authors have other social compensations other than their books. Nevertheless, I always remember the responsibility of the black literary critic, which is not for bad, wherever the bad, with the good compositions that we have a serious problem in Brazil of not recognizing and acknowledging our aesthetic quality. We always say, like Alain de Souza said the other day, I heard Ricardo Elisha sitting out in the audience, whenever I do a critique, I have a commitment with the literary quality, black literary quality, which is not acknowledged. Well, black, of the good authors and the good black and men and women authors, well, as long as it's not acknowledged, we're not going to be able to recognize the bad authors.
So, Saidiya, this path to the Forest of Light is a journey, and to write about journeys, you do it beautifully. And To Lose Your Mother, this journey along the Atlantic Slave Road, you do this journey between Ghana until the current days. Could you tell us a little about your book, Lose Your Mother, and how was the process to write it?
I too am delighted to be here. I love telling impossible stories. And so when I began writing Lose Your Mother, I was on the trail of those who had been enslaved, basically, and were making their way from the African interior to the West African coast. They were enslaved people who didn't, leave textual documents or any of the kind of evidence that, as historians, we're trained to find to tell people's stories. So writing Lose Your Mother changed me as a writer and a thinker. And it changed me in that there was not only the research process, but I was forced to utilize imagination, and I also learned how to write from the heart, how to take intuition and feelings and to treat them seriously, the production of knowledge. So it was a journey that undid me and it remade me.
Continua.
I will continue with you, Saidiya. If you could maybe talk about critical affabulation, where you mixed fiction with academic historical research, and how was this meeting with your literary voice?
So for the record, I should say that I don't think of myself as creating fictions, but really using speculation and imagination to be able to tell impossible stories. For the history of Black people, enslaved people, oppressed groups, subaltern groups, it was intended to make our histories impossible to tell, right? And so for me, how could I tell the story where the archival record ran out? And some of the ways I did that were through transposing and creating collective stories. So I told the story of a young woman who was murdered aboard a slave ship by a ship's captain. There were only 7 words about her in the trial transcript. So I needed to cull the entire British archive, all of the travel logs of ship's captains, doctors' journeys, to recreate the material conditions of her existence and really to try to build that story out through embodied knowledge. So she didn't say, or it wasn't recorded that she said, oh, I want to die on this slave ship, but there was another woman on another ship who said that. So I collected utterance from all of these places, and then I tried to imagine her story by literally imagining the physical conditions in which she existed and kind of building story out through sensual details. So critical fabulation is exhaustive archival research, imagination, and pushing beyond the limits of the archive. But I think that history is making stories generally, right? And I think that there's more a pressure on us to not be faithful to the protocols of disciplinary practice to really resurrect these histories of Black people.
Rita, the prologue of your book, critique of colonialism in your essays, you talk about the bewilderment of how long it took your work to be published in Brazil. And there, backstage, we were talking about the story about the picture. So I wanted to ask if you could tell me a little bit about the story of your book, La Crítica de la Colonialidad, and the picture on the cover of a black woman holding that child, who that child was, and all the debate surrounding that.
Okay, there are two different questions here. The delay in publishing a book which I wrote in Brazil, but I'll be brief because this is a festival and I don't want to go on too long and make this. In the University of Brasilia, where I was a professor since 1985 until I retired in 2017 as an honorary professor, so I participate there. But in the meantime, since we had a case of racism at the university in Brasilia, discrimination, group discrimination, when flunking 3 tests in the Department of Anthropology, where a student failed with discrimination. You couldn't say the word racism because racism in Brazil is a crime. So there was some kind of, after we won the struggle, several years later, 2 years later, backing the student because the student had suffered an brutal injustice. His tests were not corrected, and he was flunked when he addressed the professor. And I coordinated the graduate studies, go to the professor, asking him to review your test. The professor said to him, I don't speak with nobodies. That was when the struggle began, the struggle for quotas. It was incredible for Brazil. Brazil doesn't know exactly. There are people who think that it was Lula with a stroke of his pen, and there was the stroke of a pen, but a long time later. In other words, other people think that it was the State University in Rio. It was the first university that applied quotas, but a law that passed in the city council, not a debate in the university, just like in the University of Brasilia. It was based on this specific case. We began a struggle in Jorge de Carvalho and myself to think in Brazil it was indispensable to guarantee entry and enrollment and permanence of black students, and some affirmative actions as well for indigenous students at the University of Brazilian universities. So this debate that already exists in the social movement, but as a debate by the university began in Brasilia, and it began with a student that was flunked without his test having even been corrected. So this story is a long story, and I'm going to write a book about it with all these details before I die. I vow that I'm going to do that before I die, because to tell the story is essential. For that reason, my books, the first book is a book prior to the quotas, which is a book about Xangô of Brazil, and the other books, and myself, my person, we suffered blockade. It's called cancellation now, cancel culture. That word didn't exist before, but there was cancer culture against me and my students as well. For example, one of my students has Deborah Denise, who is a professor of law, and Tanya Mayra, who is a professor of sociology, Anderson Flor, who is a black student, a professor of philosophy, and there are numerous students that are professors in a number of different departments at the University of Brasilia, but none of my students is a full professor. The Department of Anthropology, it's a proof of the terrible persecution that took place in our department, and my students. And myself suffer in the Brazilian University because we denounced for the first time and before the Supreme Court in Brazil, because this case at the University of Brazil went in 2012, went all the way to the Supreme Court of Brazil. It finally announced and ruled that affirmative actions are fully constitutional. They don't violate any constitutional principles, so it's a long process, and Brazil doesn't even know. It was the University of Brasilia proposed affirmative action. It reached the Supreme Court. It was silence. It was like a mantle of silence in this process. That's whenever I can, I tell this story, and I tell and rather vehemently of what happened. But in this book, that the portrait, it's being taken years later, translating books and texts which were books that were written in Brazil. It's been publishing in Brazil now, that book with the portrait on 24 years after the beginning of this case in 1998. So this book with the portrait at the center of the book, The Critique of Coloniality, which is being launched now, has an analysis of coloniality in Brazil, which is the case of a portrait, which I saw for the first time years ago, probably maybe almost 30 years ago, in the Museum of Petropolis, which is this portrait, which is the cover of that book, my book, which is a wet nurse, an African wet nurse. I think that she was African, with a white child holding her in her arms, and the baby with his hand on her breast. And I saw this portrait. This portrait captivated me at the moment. That's Dom Pedro II, the emperor. There's a little label that says Jean de Baptiste Debré, a painter of the court, a great painter of the royal family in Brazil. Many years went by before. It's always trying. It took decades try to have people confirm my impression that this was Dom Pedro, the emperor of Brazil, and his so-called black mother, quote unquote. So the wet nurse. So finally, I found many long times in Gainesville Library in the United States, Pedro Calmon, who had for the first time seen in a book this portrait, and he said, that is Dom Pedro II as a baby in the hands of his wet nurse. So I'm on the right track. So from that point on, in the book, it's reported the story and told the story. In the chapter, there began a number of maneuvers to deny that that was actually Dom Pedro II, the emperor. So it's cataloged as a little boy in the arms of his wet nurse, rather. Nobody ever has a painting of a neighbor of the palace, much less inside the palace. It would be totally absurd to think, what other white child could that have been inside the palace? It would be comic. It would be funny if it weren't tragic. So I'm showing the maneuvers to deny that it's the mother, the patriotic mother of Brazil is Africa, and one of the patriotic mothers, and I like Lele Gonzalez. It's a mother Africa, a crossroads between America and Africa, the welcoming arms of the blacks for the indigenous peoples for a little course of 500 years. It's a Amerindian Africa, so the mother of Brazil is Amerindian Africa. So the portrait represents what people try to deny. The last maneuver, which is longer in the book, but after several different publications, is that the portrait says now it's not by Debré. So now they're denying the painter that painted it, but not the person that's portrayed in the portrait, or persons.
Luiz, now talking about intersections between domination structures, tell us a little bit about your most recent book, Afro-Marxism, and what do you propose and how are you going to deal with reality?
I'm not a sociologist or an anthropologist. I am a literary critique, and people sometimes, when we touch on other things, they think we're fleeing, shirking the original theme, but you're pursuing an object, and the object is literature. Sometimes literature takes you to the forest of light through journalism, sometimes diving into a swimming pool full of rats. That's part of my work, pursuing the literary object. Certainly, literature does not exist in Brazil. If it does not exist in a void, rather, I'm forced. I have no desire to dirty my hands with topics that are boring, and I would rather stay home reading Proust and Toni Morrison. But whenever I do that, someone comes and ask me, saying that I cannot take care of literature in the world outside, when the world outside is a chaos. So I'm going to help you fix the world, and you stop busting my balls, and I'm going to go back to literature myself. This is never going to happen, of course, because if literature is out in the world, and the world is chaos, we're going to have to do both things at the same time. We're going to have to read literature, and we're going to have to fix the world at the same time. And when I think the state of things, I cannot avoid the idea that we are diving into this swimming pool of rats. It's called capitalism, and this swimming pool of rats controls how the production and how things are received of literary works in the world. This swimming pool full of rats, we have to struggle against this all the time. It's not an absolutely terrible. We have significant victories against capitalism, and I can say that this flip is one of them. This victories, unequivocal victories, and the result of our resistance. And when I think of Afro-Marxism, I think, what can I do to be beaten by both sides, by the white Marxists and by the people that thinks that Marxism cannot help blacks. So I wrote this book, but it's all to attempt to understand that the economic issue interferes in black publishing production, the circulation of ideas. It interferes in our existence. I cannot make literature if I'm going hungry. So the theme of economics is an interesting. Afro-Marxism is an effort, an attempt to use a tool to understand better the literary object, and sometimes this causes a lot of argument and misunderstanding, but we have to do what's necessary to be done. And this is very different from saying that we are against and everything. People say, oh, you're against people's wealth and everything. No. It's a difference between against capitalism and being against being poor. They're different things. A person decides at the end of the month he has no money and protest against capitalism. I'm going to start reading Marx and I'm going to become a Marxist critic. And the next day he receives his wages and said, okay, capitalism is great. And I changed my mind. He doesn't like to be poor. They're different things.
The mediator cannot say anything. I'm not going to say anything. But I have to say, no, I do agree. I agree. There is no social justice without economic justice. But Saidiya, now this is a question for you. In Brazil, there's a lot of similarities with the challenges that you found in Ghana. For instance, in terms of trying to revisit your memories. In Brazil, documents that have to do with slavery were destroyed. So we can't know, for instance, how people, black people, where they came from where in Africa we came, because of this act of the Brazilian government destroying the documents. How is it possible for us to revisit this memory in situations such as that?
Michel Ralph Trujillo in Silencing the Past, deals with this question, and I think it requires a revolution of the episteme, a radical transformation in how we know and what we can validate. I think that interdisciplinary knowledge is essential to rectifying this past. Evidence is only one part of the story, of telling history. Another part is the limits of the imagination itself. Trujillo says that, in the context of the Haitian Revolution was an event that was unthinkable for Western historians. How could black people have a revolutionary consciousness? How could they defeat the European empire? So it was politically unimaginable, it was cognitively unimaginable. So I think that we have to be really creative. I think that their documents are hidden, they're destroyed, they're burnt, and it's a way of not attending to the kind of structural inequality that Luiz is talking about. I mean, for half a century, Western historians tried to pretend that racial slavery had nothing to do with the development of capitalism, that it wasn't essential to modernity. So I think we push back on a number of levels, that we can't fixated with evidence, but I think that there are other people who can help us. Big data scientists, demographers, people who do work on material culture in our songs, in our cultural practices. They contain historical knowledge. So I just think that we have to set about the business of retelling, retelling these stories with what we have and not have the lack of certain kinds of archives be an impasse to that knowledge, right? Because it's designed to be an impasse that we can't overcome, but we can push through that enclosure.
Let me continue here with you, Saidiya. In Brazil, there's this understanding, common sense, putting a black woman as a fighter, a strong woman, a warrior all the time. How is this stereotype present in the American society? And in this context, do you believe that literature has a role, an important role, to deconstruct the stereotype of the black woman warrior?
I'm sorry, I can't keep my headphones on. It's too weird because we're in conversation. I think literature does have a vital role to play in deconstructing that. That image is harmful. That image is related to the notion that we can bear and endure conditions that other people can't, right? That we have a higher threshold of pain than others. That we can suffer anything and continue to go on. And in the US in particular, that notion, I mean, it's killing black women, right? We're dying from it. So I think that the gift of literature is the way we can attend to our collective experience, but with detail, with feelings, with affect, and we don't have to be kind of, a one-dimensional figure, a superwoman, a woman who's, forced to endure the worst conditions in the world as if it's not doing us damage, right? So much is extracted from black women, not only in terms of our labor, but in terms of the painting Rita was talking about, our reproductive capacities. We tend to and care for the entire world, and it is killing us.
Rita, now this connection with Saidiya's answer. In your work, you open this dialogue and you theorize, and you're also an activist on behalf of women's rights. And in the introduction of the critique against coloniality, you say that you don't want to have a civilizatory feminism. So if you could maybe talk a little about this relationship between coloniality and the patriarchy.
Coloniality existed inside the social movement of all social movements. Feminism and the black movement, there is coloniality as well. So we have to perceive this because of good intentions. The paths to hell are paved with good intentions. Feminism has to respond to women's and the way of existence of feminisms. White and black, who have their varieties inside them as well. It's a plural world. I think that before feminist, I'm a radical pluralist. I have my compass, my fate, what I want, my compass. Where I orient my politics is for a radically plural world, where what is the limit for my pluralism? It's those ideas which are not pluralistic. So that's where I run up against them. That's where I run up against my ambition runs up against opening up to pluralism of projects and goals and happiness, etc. So, what I say there is this civilizing mission and NGOs, international cooperation we see in several different countries, ways of encouraging projects, both feminist and also other social movements, which sometimes don't come from the ground itself, the grassroots. When you're talking about Saidiya, I remembered a great North American activist who's Michael Hunter, I think, I fought with him once. It's kind of complicated because he was rather heavy set, not only important, but physically heavy set. But we had an argument because I had criticized his writings, his work where he states that the Brazilian black movement is deficient and doesn't go anywhere because it's culturalist. And I understand that Saidiya is saying here that culture can give us elements to rebuild this story. In my case, I studied for a long time candomblé in Recife, and that's where a critique of the state. I learned there visceral distrust of the state field, the state, and sometimes positioning itself as not entering the black movement, because the black movement proposed that the debate was in the public space, in the agora, with the state, and people with whom I lived for many years showed suspicion of distrust, visceral distrust towards the state in the state arena. So I call this community a door, a half-open door. When there's a good state, a progressive state, fine, which gives you funds and rights to funds, both. You take your hand, reach out your hand, take the resources and rights, and close the door as quickly as possible. And you continue your story in hiding, which in the case of Candomblé, it was the family of saints, a domestic hiding places for something which is a political project like this. So people are going to criticize culturalism, and we don't get anywhere. We have to have the debate in the public space with the state for Brazilian history, for the history of civilization, what I call the black codex in Brazil. That's false, because history has to be heard there. That's where history is heard, but it's heard in a different way, coded in a different way, but there is a historical knowledge there, and it's cultural. So you cannot say that it's worthless, the Brazilian black movement, because the Brazilian black is very culturalist. It's based on candomblé and samba and carnival and everything like that. That's false. In this culture, transits history, moves memory, but it's necessary to listen closely to see what they're saying. For example, I'll repeat again, they're saying clearly that the state is not reliable or trustworthy.
Rita?
Would you like to react to her comments?
I too agree that when we look at, everyday forms of black practice, that I would say that there's not only a suspicion to this, towards the state, but that there's an antagonism towards the state, because the state is largely the agent of violence, of extraction, and of enclosure. When we think about the history of Marxist thought or the history of anarchism, people aren't folding in the ongoing, hundreds years long black practice against empire and state. So I would just say, yes.
Luiz, and the same idea in a society that creates an imaginary of the Brazilian black literature, what are the possibilities you find to build new imaginations, new spaces?
The first thing that I've observed is that these processes have changed a lot in recent years, and for a reason, two reasons at least, for two reasons. the overwhelming ones. First, a positive reason we were able to achieve several different historical demands of struggles in the black movement, of people who began long before us here, and to whom we owe much, and who delivered us a much better world than they received, without a shadow of a doubt. The second reason is a side effect, which was the election of a certain president of the Republic who had bad diction, had bad thinking, bad manners, but had blue eyes. And I know that any black person who is hearing me now, and especially white people as well, know how difficult it is for a black person to get a job in this country. Listening to what we've passed through with selection process, we had to prove that we know a lot of things. We had to behave properly and have a long CV or resume. But to be the president of the country, you can be anything as long as you're white. That this is paradoxical, showing white people, including several of my friends, that I wasn't joking when I said that racism had practical reverberations. They thought that racism was a moral problem. Growing up, believing that it was suffice that if they were not racist, to me, for the world to not be racist. And that, I think, are important things to say. But all of this against our creative force infines our literary force. And I think I learned a lot with the books by Saidiya. I had lunch with Professor Hartman in 10 minutes. Her explanation about Ralph Allison, she taught me more than I'd learned from my studies in 10 years. So just to show you how much we can learn. And I'm totally convinced that all of the temple grounds, the worshiping grounds, the music, the samba, and all of this is imagination, literary imagination. Our bodies are literature, and it's from this imagination, this firm, strong imagination, resistance will emerge for the interpretation of this literary critique that I like so much. It's not what I imagined. I thought that it was an accumulation of information from academia. We had to read more and more about the world, the Western world, and we would discover how to do it. But today I think it's the opposite. We need to read more of the world that we know, and find a way to translate these things for the academic world. When this happens, we will dominate the world and take over the world.
Let me continue with you, Luiz. You were talking about the current situation. How do you see from this moment forward? What do you think about this reconstruction?
I've never been an optimistic. I'm a pessimist. I always think that the plane is going to crash when it doesn't crash. It didn't crash this time, at least, thank goodness. But I'm truly optimistic. I think that we are going to be able to, starting in January, to do things that we were not able to do the way that we should do them. I hope that this optimism will not become a disappointment, but it's important for us to have dreams once in a while.
Rita, you were talking about candomblé, and I wanted to ask you, with the representations of the orishas, what are your perspectives that you absorbed in your work to think about race and gender?
This question, I have my first period as a researcher in the phase of my PhD research, and I call the happy period of my anthropology, because truly candomblé, as I found it, because there have been changes since then, it was a field where 20 years ago, a crime which we would call femicide, but it was a woman who killed another woman in a amorous relationship which ended in a femicide, but in a couple of women. So these women have this, in Simone de Beauvoir diaries, there are authors who talk about the power of women's sovereignty over the space of candomblé because politics are hidden behind this veil, because in this fold, in this hiding place, the history passes of a civilization and it continues, the African codex expanding. So this is inserted or ended when a year later I encountered violence. Two things that keep me connections between them. I never was able to connect them. This world of candomblé is not a world where there is what we know as gender violence. At the time that I knew it in Recife, in the most traditional temples in Recife, Paiadão is temple around his worshiping grounds. I learned greatly how the world, democratic in terms and gender terms, with transitivity, with gender transition, like there are many pre-colonial worlds, as in many worlds not touched deeply by the process of modernization, colonialism, with the notion of quote-unquote normal in our continent and also in Guinea and Africa and other worlds where there's a gender transitivity. So a biological non-determinism in terms of gender. So candomblé, I learned this nature is invented. My text is called, written in a thesis that I defended in 1984 and I was published in 1986. It's called The Invention of Nature. A long time ago, when people began to talk about gender, I learned that gender is an analytical category. In candomblé, I saw the indetermination of gender according to biology and body. I learned this in candomblé. It's a place for powerful women. So this was a lesson for me, a political lesson in terms of feminism, and hopeful as well. Then in Brasilia, I met up with violence during a request at the rector, the dean, and there's no connection. My subsequent research on violence with what I'd learned in candomblé. So this is extremely important to realize. In other words, for me, this candomblé shows and teaches another way of building a person, the construction of the person, the construction of human psyche and other constructions, sexuality, which is very different from that of modernity, white modernity, which is violent. Femicide is modern. Femicide is modern. It's a much more egalitarian world in candomblé. So if you learn there, in a sense, you should turn this into a policy. That's why when we were talking, I think that the words are essential. In other words, the humanity, this task of ours, which would be possible to call the task of intellectuals, it's the most political task of all, because when we build narratives, and we offer to society the key to organize the world and to send story in one direction or another, the power of humanity is the power to name and narrate. It's fundamental, essential, crucial. It's the giving shape to the world and to the future.
Well, I have questions from the audience. I will ask some of these questions now. Saidiya, first question directed to you. A person from the audience asks, how can fiction help historiography?
I can give you many concrete examples. I think that when we think about the African diaspora and we think about our understanding of slavery, the work of a poet critic like Edward Glissant, a novelist like Toni Morrison, Maurice Condé, Edward Jones, they taught us to think about the institution and imagine it in ways that far exceeded that of historians. There's a great novel, I don't know if it's been translated yet, by Ed Jones. It's called The Known World, and it's a novel that opens with an enslaved man lying on the earth. It is raining, and he is masturbating. I had never even thought about that image before, and partly what that opening reminded me of is, you know, like, oh, we have our full sensory experience, even in the context of captivity and enslavement. Morrison, you know, attending to the violence that utterly structures the institution, yet the attention to beauty, the importance of love in a world that does not love you. I mean, those were the lessons of the novelists and the poets, not the historians. So I think that that work has actually shifted and changed historical practice. And we know from many writers in the African diaspora, whether we think of someone like Kamau Brathwaite, Erna Broadburst, Isher, the kind of divisions that divide knowledge production, they have no fidelity to that. They're doing historical research, they're writing poetry, they're writing novel. We know Morrison did, you know, incredible historical research to write the things that she wrote, but what that work is able to do is it's able to capture the philosophy of Black freedom, right? And that philosophy of Black freedom, which is a philosophy of the heart, of a practice against the plantation and against this, you know, racialized order, has been a philosophy that has been difficult for others to transpose, right? Because it's not necessarily embodied in documents, but that's what novelists and poets have given us. And so I think that that's actually a great gift to historiography, because it's a reorientation of our cognitive maps, and it's a kind of a breaking open, you know, of the fourth wall in the domain of thought.
Luiz, a question from the audience to you. Your fictions will bring a language and text that are very strong, silences, and open pages and blank pages in some of these books. What are these spaces of silence with regards to racism?
There's an anecdote about this. In one of the texts that I explain for people that aren't familiar, I thought that a way of representing silence of women in the Black world, in the male world, corrected himself, was to leave the apostrophes open. They talk with an open quotes, and you understand what they say through the version of the men, or when they're speaking without men being present. So the quotes are empty before that. When the first version came to the press, the person from the press said that there's a problem in the proof, and he said, I gave him the theory about the attempt to represent the effacement of language there, and he said, okay, it's going to be wrong, you're going to leave it like that, wrong? Is that what you actually want? So it was an attempt almost, it was a quixotic attempt rather, in some way the language has to represent our discoveries. Perhaps later in the future, this may be some way corroborating the silence in relation to this, but at the moment, it's what I can do. It's like leaving the quotes empty in these cases.
Rita.
Rita, a question from the audience to you. On the narrative regarding the struggles for the quotas at the University of Brasilia, where are the activists of the Black movement in your struggle?
I don't know if activism per se, in the sense of a social movement, a Black movement, if there was always aspiration for affirmative actions and quotas, but how the process played out there in the University of Brasilia, we have a Black actor who's central, who's Ari Lima, who is that student who, as many other students in our university and in other universities in Brazil, were flunked unfairly. In his case, he had a heroic gesture. He fought for his rights, and the time passed a great duress and fear. He underwent great duress and fear, but he persisted in his claim. So Ali was a hero. I'm not the only one. Nilma, who is accompanying this, because a curious phenomenon happened last week. 24 years later, this case reappeared on the surface of the memoirs, the history. I mean, I want to tell the whole story, but the case, the Ari's case, he was assaulted again by a professor in the Department of Brazil when he was invited. This is in a lot of correspondence and emails and everything. This circulated last week with a large number of messages and declarations and statements, including journalist notes in UOL and Brazilian Correio Brasiliense in the newspaper, the mainstream newspaper. This case reappeared because 24 years later, he was invited by an organization called Black Anthropologists to talk at the University of Brazil, that place which had mistreated him and trampled on his rights terribly and traumatically. He was invited to come back, and he came back. He gave his inaugural keynote lecture at the workshop of Black Anthropologies, and when he did the keynote lecture, he narrated what had happened with him 24 years age, and people discriminated against him again. Ari Lima at the University of Brasilia, and he was booed. It was in 2022, and you will find a number of messages and declarations reacting to that and news concerning this topic. So he was a central protagonist of this, so to speak, this sad incident, this sad happening event, and his struggle was the struggle that led to the fact that it's now acknowledged the issue of quotas. That's where quotas start, because he never gave up, and it was hard for him because it was terrible for his mental and physical health. The best thing for him personally would have been to give up, but he did not give up. He persisted.
Maybe we have time for one last question for Saidiya. During lunch you said that you had come to Brazil in the 90s, and now you came back and you saw many differences. So what are the differences you perceived in these different times, and how do you feel the translation of your work into Portuguese with the Brazilian public? How do you feel they welcome that?
I feel very happy about the translation of the work into Portuguese, because even as our situations are distinct, there are many resonances, even more so because of our recent presidents who shall go unnamed. And I think that we're living in these kind of democratic nation states that are founded on racial slavery and indigenous genocide. So there's much, history that is shared. I was telling the story about my first trip to Brazil to a young woman on the flip staff, and I said, I came to Brazil before you were born. She said, no. I told her when I came, she said, yes, it was before I was born. And so she asked me that question, and then she kind of pushed back, rightly so, against my answer. I said, when I came in the 90s and I went to the universities, there were no black people there. There were no black people there. It was so striking to me. And she said, so you see a few black people here now, and are you happy with that? I said, no. In a moment of opening, we have to keep on pushing, and making as much transformation as we can, because we know from our great thinkers, European philosophers included, progress is not inevitable. We have come out of these moments of reaction, and fascism and authoritarianism is a threat around the globe. So I think that this is a moment of potential and opening in Brazil, and I just feel good to see so many young Black artists and writers and curators, so much activity and movement, and it's really inspiring to me that the Brazilian university is being radically transformed by affirmative action, as in the US, the Supreme Court, will probably end the last vestiges of affirmative action, which was also critical to transforming the university in the US. So those are some of the things that I have changed, but we need to keep on making change happen.
Muito obrigada.
Thank you very much. We, of course, could stay here for hours and hours on end, but we do have to close. Come on, you guys, let me hear you. So, we have here the authors, and I will include myself. Among them, we will be signing our books at the Livraria da Travessa bookshop, so you're all invited to attend for a signing. And I would like to thank Fernanda Basto, Milena Brito, Fernando Meira for the curatorship, the presence of all of you. I would like to thank Saidiya, Luiz, and Rita for this amazing roundtable. It was a great teaching for all of us. Thank you so much.